Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about what to look for in healthy fish when you're buying especially high-end fish that are larger, centerpiece type fish. But we're going to be talking about fish overall, the health of them before you make a purchase, making a good decision on that purchase by looking for a few things. So when we come back, we're going to talk about that. Hang in there with me and we'll be right back. As I said in the intro, it is an important thing to look for a few things when you're buying fish that may give you some clues as to the health of that fish. And it's very important, especially if you're buying high-end fish such as discus, severums, those kinds of fish that are going to be expensive. And this doesn't pertain necessarily just to freshwater, but also to saltwater fish. But I'm talking about freshwater fish because that's what I deal in. But you can carry some of this over to your saltwater aquariums if you're looking for these basic things that I'm going to be talking about. Now, the first thing that I do when I look at a fish that I'm looking at purchasing is, does that fish have a brightness of their eyes? Now, I know that seems maybe silly to you because the fish have bright eyes or whatever. Now, this is particularly noticeable in fish that are larger, such as discus, angels, severums, these kinds of fish that are expensive, but they do have a certain brightness to their eyes if they're healthy. And what I mean by that is they should look like they're not droopy-eyed or sad looking or anything like that, because it's very, very common to overlook something like that, and that can be a great indicator as to whether or not they have some internal problems that you don't know anything about, and you get them home and find out you've got some problems on your hands. So look for a brightness in the eye. Make sure that those fish look perky, that they're I think you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a brightness of eye. It's kind of like a human being. When we're sick, our eyes are very telling sometimes as to whether or not we are feeling good or we're not. And the same thing goes for fish. Now, the second thing I want you to look for is any kind of irregularities on the fish's body, such as white spots, puffy white spots that look like cotton, spots that are on the tail area, on their fins, the areas that are a little bit more see-through or very thin parts of their skin, because these are going to be indicators of a couple of different possibilities of problems, and that would be, number one, ick. The second thing would be some kind of a fungal or bacterial disease of some sort. And these are great indicators that something is going on there, and you probably want to avoid those fish and make sure that you kind of point out to your supplier that that's going on. They may not even know if you're buying them from a fish store. They may not even know because they may be so busy that they don't really look at their fish that close. Now, you can't do this obviously if you're buying stuff online, but mention this to your supplier that you want to make sure that the fish are bright-eyed and some of these other things that we're going to talk about. I didn't mean to segue there, but I thought I'd get that in there so I didn't forget. But it's very important that you look their body over. Look for irregularities as far as what the fish is supposed to be shaped like. A lot of times with tetras and that kind of thing, there is a unique disease to neon tetra. It's called neon tetra disease, where their body gets kind of a hump in it. Don't buy those fish. They're very, very, very inbred, and there's a lot of that goes on out there. And so when we're talking about that particular fish or tetras in general, look for those kinds of things. Look for fish that are very active in the tank, Look for fish that don't have any kinds of spots all over them. That's a good sign that they have ick. If you're new to the hobby, this is something that's going to get by you very quickly, especially from big box stores like Petco, PetSmart, and these kinds of places. They don't have the talent or the knowledge. Their employees typically do not have a lot of knowledge about what kind of diseases their fish may have until it's too late and you've brought them home and you've infected your tank and whatever. So obviously I'm going to tell you the next thing that you want to make sure is that you have a quarantine tank. If you do not have a quarantine tank, then you are making a disastrous mistake of putting them into your regular community tank or regular population tank, because you're going to spread disease all through that tank. And especially if you have high-end fish in there, that is an absolute no-no. That would be something I would be very, very concerned about. So make sure you have at a minimum a 20-gallon quarantine tank, and a larger one if you can possibly afford it. Keep it set up all the time. Maintain it just like you would any other tank. Now the second thing I want to talk about is diseases that are internal, things that you may not see, or diseases that are obvious on the fish's body. Now, if a fish has bloat, that means that they've probably been overfed. This happens a lot in big box stores, and this is a very common thing that you will see, and the fish will look very, very big. Their scales will almost pine cone out. That is a good indicator that this fish has bloat or some kind of a swim bladder problem, and that's not something you want to deal with either, especially if you're buying discus, severums, angels, and those kinds of fish, because it's very, very difficult to come back from that once they've been stressed like that in the tank, and then you're bringing them home, putting them in a tank, in your quarantine tank, and you've got to medicate them and all that. It's very, very difficult to bring a fish back from that. Now, there are some cures for some of this stuff. If you are seeing bloat in a fish that you might have at home already, I'm going to throw this in there. Use some Epsom salts. Make sure it is Epsom salts that's used for constipation and that kind of thing, because these are the only kind of Epsom salts you want to use. You don't want to use anything that obviously has any kind of fragrances or anything like that in there, because it is definitely going to be a real problem for your tank. So be careful when you're buying Epsom salts, but that is a good treatment for any fish that is suffering from bloat or swim bladder problems and that sort of thing. Now, these things are not always constipation caused. They can be problems with a bacterial infection that you cannot see. You're going to have to do your homework on that. There's lots of antibacterials, antifungals out there. There are wide spectrum medications that CChem make, that API make. Lots of different companies make these medications to get your fish healthy. And if you've made a mistake, you know, we all do. If you buy a fish and you've made a mistake, you didn't look it over well enough, and you get home and you find out you have an issue, the best thing to do is to treat it right away as soon as you see it in that quarantine tank before you ever put it into your community tank or your population tank, because you just don't want these issues spreading around your tank. Now, something else I would look for is if a fish is being picked on, that may have something to do with the personality of that fish. So if you're buying a fish and he's really pretty and he's got some nice color and stuff like that, and you just can't resist, but his fins are all nipped up and that sort of thing, and you look around the rest of the tank and the rest of the fish aren't like that, that means that that guy's been singled out because that fish is a little bit timid and he's being picked on. He's not fighting back. He's not finding his pecking order in the group. And that would be something that I would be careful of as well. I would not buy a fish like that simply because you're going to bring that same problem home with you and have the same issues in your tank of, you know, the fish is not going to change its personality and not be timid, especially if you're adding to a tank that you already have. and not putting all of them in at the same time. So this is something that is overlooked really easily. People will get their mindset on the idea that they want a particular fish. It's got a few anomalies to it, and they tell themselves, well, you know, the fins will grow back and whatever. Well, that's true. That's true for the most part, but the bottom line is if the fish has a personality issue where it doesn't seem to stick up for itself in the tank, that's not going to change when you bring that fish home. So if you see frayed fins or nipped at fins and that sort of thing, you want to make sure that you probably should avoid that fish, simply because it's not going to be a fish that is going to do well in a tank with its peers in there. So now other diseases that you might look for are hole in the head disease. That sometimes is hard to find or see when you're looking at a fish, but make sure you look that fish over really, really well. That can happen anywhere in the top part of their head, around their jaw, near their gill area. It almost looks like somebody drilled a hole in the top of their head or in the side of their face or something like that. And it's called hole in the head disease. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's exactly on their head, but it is a problem that needs to be treated. There are medications out there for that. You can treat that. But again, I would avoid those kind of fish if you're seeing them in the store. So be looking for these kinds of things. I'm trying to give you a perspective on what you should be looking for when you're buying fish, rather than, you know, fish that you already have at home. If you're having these issues at home, then you have other problems that you need to address, and I don't want to get into that today because that's not this kind of video. So I want to talk about when you're buying new fish, what you should be looking for. And again, that is one of those things that can be overlooked real easy, especially on a fish that has a lot of patterns on them and color that's kind of mixed in. It would be real easy to overlook something like that. So you want to look for that and make sure that that is not an issue that you're going to have to deal with when you get the fish home. Now, the final thing I want to talk about here is with discus in particular. If a discus has what I call a pinched in head, right up around their forehead here, if their head is pinched in there, almost like you took a piece of clay. Somebody described it to me that way a long time ago, and I think it was Gabe Posada down at Watley Discus talked about this, how if you see that pinched in area around the real high end of their forehead on a discus fish, or even on Severums or Angels, you might see this a little bit. It's an indication that they're sick because they're not eating properly and they're kind of wasting away. You want to avoid those kind of fish as well. Don't buy fish because you're emotional about the color of the fish or whatever. If the fish isn't healthy, you're just bringing yourself a lot of problems home. Now, these are only a few things that I've hit on. These are some of the obvious things. Of course, there are going to be internal problems that you don't know anything about, such as parasites and so forth. Deworm your fish. Use metronidazole on any new fish in your quarantine tank so that you can flush that out of their system. If they're eating, mix it in with their food and feed it to them. It's the quickest way to clean their system out. And also Epsom salts, like I said, is very useful this as well. And there's lots of ways to treat these problems. If you have overlooked something when you're making a purchase and you get them home and you say, geez, you know, I didn't see that in the store or whatever, there are ways. If you can't bring the fish back, there are ways to take care of these problems. But look at them really closely in the store and look at them again very closely when you get them home in your environment, so that you can see if your fish are suffering from some kind of diseases that are unacceptable to you, or if they're treatable and you've dealt with this before and you feel like you can treat it, that's fine. And there are policies sometimes with stores where they don't let you bring fish back, especially high-end fish like discus and Severums and that sort of thing. Sometimes it's a problem. So you want to make sure that you're looking at these fish very closely in the store. Like I said, bright eyes, swimming, no frayed fins, no obvious cottony looking spots on their tails or their dorsal fins, or holes in the head, or things like that. Things that are very obvious. Now, like I said, the internal things you're not always going to know about, but you can treat those things. Again, internal parasites is the most common thing you're going to deal with, or bloat. If you're seeing bloat in a fish, don't buy it, obviously, but if you didn't see it and you weren't paying attention, I like to treat them with Epsom salts anyway, just to clean them out and make sure that you know, they are not having a problem like that. Thank you for joining me today. Please leave your comments down below. If you have any questions, I will get back to you, hopefully within 24 to 48 hours. Typically that's what I do. If you've been on my channel for a while, you know that I always try to get back to everyone if they have a question. Sometimes I miss something. I'm not perfect, but I do try to get back with people. Thank you for watching. Give me a thumbs up on this one. I really appreciate it. And if you have not subscribed to the channel already, please subscribe and help me build the channel a little bit here. And like I said before, I've said it a million times, this is not my job. This is a hobby for me. I do something totally different. Most of you know what that is. I'm not going to get into that today, but this is a hobby for me, and I want to help you make sure that you're getting good quality fish and that you're having a good experience in the hobby, because there's nothing worse than somebody getting into the hobby and then having problems right away. And these are avoidable problems. The ones that I'm talking about today are things that are typically obvious in a fish, and it's nice to look at the fish in the store and catch it before you buy the fish, and maybe move on to something different or a different fish if you're seeing that. Again, important to have that quarantine tank, important to look your fish over the next 2 or 3 days after a purchase to make sure nothing develops. Ick is something that's going to develop within 24 to 48 hours typically, if that's going to be a problem. Sometimes it's called stress ick. You'll see that a lot with rummy nose tetras and other types of fish that are kind of sensitive to travel and that sort of thing. So you know, pay attention to your supplier, that they quarantine before they sell. Make sure you're not buying fish from big box stores without knowing that they probably are not quarantined at all, that you may be buying a fish that got there that morning for all you know. Sometimes you don't have any idea when those fish come in or how long they've been there, and they haven't had a chance to develop these problems that they're going to inevitably have. Again, give me a thumbs up, leave your comments down below, subscribe, and more important, share with your friends. I appreciate it when people do that, because that's a good way for this channel to be built. And thank you again for joining me today. I appreciate it. That's it for today. We will see you on the next one. Until then, we're out of here.